In my last video, I shared my selection and swatching process for building a custom watercolor palette. So if you missed that, make sure to check it out. But today we are going to be diving into the palette setup, color mixing, and finally painting with all of my new watercolors. Setting up a new palette is one of the most relaxing things I can think of. And maybe swatching and color mixing. Okay, I love everything about getting new watercolors. And when it comes to setting up my palette, it's all about experimentation for the first few weeks. This is why I don't pour my watercolors directly into the palette. I like to insert my own half pans because it's inevitable that I want to move something around, and you'll definitely see me doing that later on. I typically put my yellows and lighter tones and earth tones at the top or left side of my palette. I do this with nearly all of my palettes because it just becomes intuitive to reach for specific colors. And if you're constantly changing the location of certain colors in all of your different palettes, I think that just causes unnecessary confusion during the painting process. I don't think there's any one right way to do it. It's really just based on what you're used to and what works best for you during the painting process. This time around, I also have a couple special colors in the palette. I'm adding titanium buff and white gouache. In my mind, titanium buff is basically gouache. It's a very opaque color, so I'm keeping those two separate from the other ones. I got some requests to show how I make my custom mixes because I nearly always have at least a couple of those in my palette. But the first thing you should know is that my custom mixes change all the time. Basically, as soon as they run out, I mix another custom color and put it in the same place. And I'm always making little adjustments based on what I need. The custom colors are mixed from other colors in the palette, and I usually have a pretty strong idea of what I want that custom color to look like straight away. And that's always based on past experience, so the colors that I find myself mixing constantly. In this case, I'm making my own version of green gold, which is actually one of my old favorites from Daniel Smith, but I realized that I can make my own and make it exactly the right tint. And I'm also making a custom purple, and you might be wondering why I'm doing that if I already have amethyst on my palette, but I wanted a more bluish purple, and I also added a tiny hint of buff titanium to this one. This is a very useful color for painting things in the distance of my landscapes. And I'm also mixing a custom turquoise, a little bit deeper than what's already in my colors. And there's plenty of room left in the palette for more custom mixes, but these are going to come in time. I already know I'm going to end up mixing a few different sandy tones. Something I've been doing more often in the last year or so is adding mediums to my watercolors. A lot of times the watercolors already contain mediums such as glycerine or honey, and these really help the paints stay moist for longer and re-wet easier. But I find that, especially for some of the colors like the Primatex or very earthy tones that tend to dry out a lot faster or are a lot harder to re-wet, adding a couple drops of glycerin or watercolor blending medium, I find this makes a massive difference in allowing me to very easily re-wet the colors, even if I let them sit for a long time. I just wanted to quickly show my palette setup. I have two travel palettes going, mainly because this is the one I'll be taking outside with me, and this is the one I will be keeping next to the couch or using in the studio until I get used to the colors a little bit more and figure out how much glycerin or blending medium I want to add to them before I put them in my bigger watercolor palette. I'm using vegetable glycerin and Winsor Newton blending medium. I'm kind of experimenting and seeing which one does a better job in helping some of the colors re-wet. This is the Frank Herring watercolor palette from Jackson's Art. It might be available elsewhere, but it has this big section where you can fit full pans. This whole section can be filled with full pans, and all of these are half pan sections. And then of course this one is one of those typical metal palettes. These ones in the middle are just held in by magnets. This palette, as you can see, looks a lot shinier than this one. And that's because I added 1 or 2 drops more of the blending medium. But even some of the colors that look like they're totally dry, if I touch them with a palette knife, you can see they're still movable. Anyways, we're gonna go on to some color mixing now. To me, one of the most important things to do after getting new colors is to memorize the color mixes. And this definitely does not happen overnight. This will take a long time. So what I typically do to start out is make a couple swatch sheets, and these are just for reference. So when I'm outside painting, I can quickly glance at this card and know what the color looks like. And then I just allow myself time to play with my colors. Sometimes this lasts a few hours, sometimes days. Sitting down and seeing what kind of colors I can make, just having fun with it. In this case, I was trying to make a whole card full of kind of light neutral tones, something I might use for rocks or beach scenes. And then I made a deeper color version, just learning about how I can mix a variety of my colors. Then I'll get a little more serious and I give myself homework, which maybe doesn't sound fun, but it really is. These are triad circles, so I start with red, yellow, and blue, whichever ones I feel like at the time. And just like the typical color wheel, I'll then mix the secondary colors and the tertiary colors. And you know, the whole point is just to see the whole spectrum of color you can create with 3 colors. I think a lot of color nerds out there will totally agree that figuring out what you can mix with your new colors is endlessly fascinating. And it is really useful. In the future, when I go outside to paint, having this in the back of my mind is going to come in so handy. I will end up wasting less time trying to decide what colors to use, and I'll just know as soon as I see my scene which ones I want to use to mix. And then the real work begins. No, I'm just kidding. Well, it kind of feels like it because this part is actually a little bit tedious. But again, throughout this process, I am discovering so many cool new mixes. I know a lot of people won't go this crazy or overboard with their mixing charts, but this is the only way I know how to memorize my colors in a faster amount of time. And because I go outside to paint and I have to make really fast decisions before the light changes or the rain moves in, knowing exactly what colors mix to do what is critical. So my favorite way to dive deeper into memorizing my colors is to make these 2 color mixing charts. I have a whole other video about this, and you can do this with both watercolor and gouache, or any paint really. But the whole idea is that you start with 1 color and you slowly introduce little by little a second color. And at the end of that line, you have the second color at full power. So you're just seeing the spectrum between 2 colors. It's a lot of mixing and cleaning off the palette and getting fresh water, and you know, that's the part that's a little tedious. But I just give myself a couple days to do this and spread it out over the course of the day. And one of the best things is that in the end, you have all of these different color families. So when you sit down and paint, if you're needing something that's a little more strong or more neutral, you can look at these side by side and easily choose which colors to use to mix. And now finally for some painting. Something I like to do to treat myself whenever I get new colors is to make this part of the process easy. So I'll fill a bunch of pages in my sketchbook with random sketches, drawings of anything from rocks to trees to, whatever comes to mind. Most of the time is just from imagination, and I just let it flow. That way, when I have time to sit down and paint, I know I can just jump right in. I don't have to figure out what to paint or spend time drawing it. It's almost like just coloring in a coloring book that I made myself. Anyways, on this first page, we have a bunch of rocks. And what I like to do to start out is just give myself mini limited palettes. So maybe choosing 3 to 5 colors per scene, per rock cluster, and then just playing. And again, it's so much about experimentation, but the more I do this, after I fill probably 5 pages, I have a really good idea of what my bronzite genuine will do versus my yellow ochre, or, whatever color I'm playing with. And then, of course, I paint outside. And the timing worked out perfectly for setting up this palette because Plein April began on April 1st. It's an art challenge where you paint outside every day during April. And I'm kind of switching between gouache and watercolor, but it's been so much fun to take this selection of new colors outside. I found that these colors were especially perfect for a beach scene. So if you want to follow along the Plein April challenge, I'm doing daily short videos here on YouTube and on Instagram, and I'm making a playlist of all of them. So if you missed any, you'll be able to watch them all in the future. Okay, I'm going to wrap this video up here, but you'll see plenty more of this palette in the future. Thanks everyone for watching and following along this fun journey.